where you have a lot of different parties who are sort of fluid and they come together and they bargain and they make deals, and some of those deals might be fairly corrupt. So someone who could be you could run for president against is now your defense minister. The U.S. doesn't have that, and Prabowo fits exactly into that mold. He didn't win, but he might be able to run again. But he directly sells himself in the same way that Duterte, Trump, Bolsonaro, others approach people, and instead of talking about problems that are in a complicated way, they say, "I'm going to fix this myself. Just trust me," and that can be very appealing to people who have lost faith.
Yes. Well, speaking of China again, since the early 1990s, China has stonewalled negotiations towards a code of conduct of parties in the South China Sea. Recently, it has indicated interest in concluding the code of conduct, talks towards the code of conduct, perhaps because of the intensified phone-ups of the U.S. Navy and other navies in the South China Sea. What are the chances that the resumed talks will produce an effective, comprehensive, and legally binding COC between ASEAN and China, considering that China has always been against legally binding COC?
I think very, very low chances. I think in terms of China putting off for years and years and years talks, and then having talks move slowly, and then stopping talks on the code of conduct, I'm not sure it has that much to do with U.S. freedom of navigation operations. It perhaps has more to do with the more secure China feels in its position in the South China Sea, the more it's willing to at least talk. But I think in terms of a legally binding code that would really apply pressure on China, I think very little chance of that. There's no reason for China to do that, and every reason for them to continue to try to stall ASEAN states, or at least come up with something that ASEAN leaders can say that they got some sort of code or some piece of paper without it being legally binding. And there's no reason from the Chinese point of view why they would want a legally binding code of conduct at this time. I can't understand why they would want that now.
Well, still there are a number of fields in which China appears to be willing to work closely with the United States, like climate change, cybersecurity, exploration of outer space. But there is a trust deficit now between the two countries, which makes cooperation difficult. Would the Biden administration, which is under pressure to play tough with China, be interested in closing this trust deficit? And what confidence-building measures could be taken by both sides to close the deficit?
I don't know if the Biden administration is under pressure. I mean, I think there's been a genuine change in thinking by a lot of U.S. policy makers, including Democrats. It's not only Republicans who have come to think that China and the U.S. have little room for cooperation. So I'm not sure that Biden is under pressure, but I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, I think that there are some issues like climate change that are so important for the world that even if the U.S. and China had a very bad, poisoned relationship, they still need to try to work together on other issues like space exploration. I'm not sure that ours rise to that level of importance. In terms of confidence-building measures, I mean, I think Biden has already made clear that on climate change, at least, it's going to be a major priority. So they will have to re-engage with China on that because he's made that a priority of all of his, almost all of his appointments so far. So it's inevitable that they will re-engage with China on that. In terms of building confidence on other issues, I don't know. But I don't think it's impossible that the U.S. and China can have a bad relationship on issues like security, some trade issues, and still work together on climate change. I mean, the U.S. and the Soviet Union had a bad relationship, to say the least, and still work together on some things. It happens all the time, you know. I mean, Singapore and Malaysia have had bad relationships about many things for years and still work together on other things. I think the same thing with Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia and Malaysia, Indonesia and Singapore, many countries in the region have had bad relations, history of bad relations, and still work together. I think the quality of an experienced, mature leader like Biden should be that he can simultaneously have poor relations about certain things while recognizing that other things are so important that he can't afford to have poor relations. So I don't know if that's possible, but I think it should be possible.
Well, again, in relation to that, maybe I should bring up the notion of the so-called Thucydides trap. Although war between the two powers is by no means inevitable, they need to work hard to avoid war. What measures should both countries take to be sure they don't fall into this trap?
Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. I mean, one thing that's obviously different that you're talking about is talking about something from ancient history where the people could create significant destruction in war, but they couldn't destroy the whole world, whereas the United States and China, like the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, have the ability to destroy each other, 10,000 times over. So I think the situation is a little bit different. But like I said, I mean, I think the situation is going to be challenging. The dynamic has changed a lot in the United States, but also in China. I think China has become much more authoritarian in the late Hu era and certainly in Xi's era. It has become more assertive and for some reasons, good reasons and bad reasons, more confident. And the US has become more hawkish about China too. I think the best approach would be to build confidence on issues that the US and China need to work together on, like climate change for the good of the world. In terms of the idea of a trap based on previous great powers, I'm not sure it necessarily is so relevant in the modern era, but I think that you can certainly see that the US and China could work together in some important areas like climate change and then use that to build confidence, even if they're growing apart on a lot of other issues.
There is a view in Southeast Asia that while the tone of the incoming Biden presidency will be more moderate and gentle, it will be more gentle. The substance will be much the same as the Trump presidency because money will continue to dominate U.S. politics. In fact, the U.S., according to some, is a plutocracy. Socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. I think Senator Bernie Sanders has been saying that. The worry is that American foreign policy might be made to serve big business, the multinationals. Do you find any merit in this view?
Sorry, I didn't get the question at the end. I mean, I think U.S. companies have always had a significant, who are multinationals, they always have a significant interest in foreign policy, but what was the question at the end?
Well, do you find any merit in this view that the U.S. is actually a plutocracy and that it is somehow captive to big business?
I don't think captive is the right word, but certainly there has been a significant shift in thinking in the U.S., even among people who have significant means and even among some big companies in the last decade, recognizing that that the U.S. is the growth that existed in the Cold War and even up into the 1990s, that often came with greater development and equity has vanished, and that's a huge problem for the U.S. I mean, that's true in other countries too. It's not like unique to the U.S. I mean, inequality has widened enormously in Indonesia, going back to Gus Dur and for certainly under SBY and has continued under Jokowi, even though Jokowi has taken some measures to address that. It's true in almost every middle income and upper income country in the world has inequality, not every, but almost every, inequality has widened enormously in the last 20 to 30 years. It's true in China. It's true everywhere in Southeast Asia. Thailand, it's true in Thailand. Thailand is one of the most unequal countries in the world. It's true in the Philippines. So it's a global problem, but it's certainly a problem in the US. And I think there's a recognition of it. The question is whether the US has the political will to do anything about it.
Well, in any case, it seems that the United States will be a divided nation for a long time to come because Trump will continue to lead a significant part of the population that is aggrieved and angry, while the progressive wing of the Democrats are also aggrieved and angry for a different reason. And an America that is weakened by internal division is bad news for ASEAN because nobody here, as it is often said, nobody here will take sides against China. But nobody here wants the US to go away. And so the fear is that the division in the US might make the United States even more inward-looking, and therefore its presence here will be ameliorated.
I don't think that Trump is necessarily the issue. Trump is a symptom of a wider problem. although certainly as President Trump has exacerbated that problem. But Trump is a symptom of a problem of intense polarization and a lot of other issues, including misinformation and inequality and rage at the political system that he fed his rise and that pre-existed him. And I also think it's probably not accurate to compare someone like Bernie Sanders, who might seem aggrieved, I'm not sure aggrieved is the right word, but is existing within the democratic system, to someone like who is trying to subvert the democratic system. The U.S. has a lot of problems. One of the problems which you sort of hinted at is that the good aspects of the two-party system is that it forces people to make a choice, and essentially a two-party system, and doesn't leave you with the type of coalition governments like you have in Indonesia or some other countries with multi-parties, where you have a lot of different parties who are sort of fluid and they come together and they bargain and they make deals, and some of those deals might be fairly corrupt or not, but the coalitions fall apart, they make new coalitions. So someone who could be you could run for president against is now your defense minister. The US doesn't have that, and so in some ways that's an advantage because people are fairly confident in their ideological views of the party. The downside is it doesn't allow for much change. And now the US is stuck in a kind of party system and rules, like you mentioned, the Electoral College, some of which really need change, but they're very hard to change. It certainly weakens foreign policy, and I don't think there's going to be a short-term answer for that. I think that ASEAN states or anyone who is, I've heard, most notably, a lot of Singaporean diplomats retired diplomats have been talking about this a lot. They're sort of yearning for the 1970s or 1980s or even early 1990s. And that era just isn't going to return because the United States is not the sole power in the world. The United States has a lot more divisions. The type of policy making you saw at that time is just not going to return. It's gone. So, I think Biden is committed much more than Trump to sort of approaching issues that Southeast Asia cares about and not being so unilateral. But to expect that he's going to approach the region the way that the United States is going to be the same actor it was 30 or 40 years ago is just it's not possible.
You wrote a book on the global retreat of democracy, and it seems that in the year 2015, a year after you published that book, the rise of populism became very apparent. What brought about this trend? Can you elaborate more on it? Is this because democratization has not resolved the problem of inequality, but rather aggravated it in many countries?
I don't think democratization aggravated inequality. Just to go back, I think I wrote that book in 2011 or 2012 when it came out in 2013. So at that point, democracy had not been doing so very well in a lot of places, and the situation has only gotten a lot worse since then. So that book was really written probably 8 or 9 years ago, and things have gotten more. I think inequality is definitely a factor in populists who have significant appeal to people who feel like there's growth, but they're not getting enough of the growth. So to take a more relevant example than Trump, like Duterte has a lot of different appeals, but one of the appeals that he made in 2016 was that in the Aquino era, the second Aquino, there had been fairly high growth. If you looked at the Philippines growth numbers, the GDP growth, they were fairly good in the 6 years of Aquino's term, but there was still incredibly high inequality. And Duterte made the argument that to a lot of people that the Aquino administration was only looking out for rich people and businesses, etc. So I do think inequality is certainly part of it, but I don't think democracy is the reason for that. I think democracy can coexist for a while with inequality, and can also coexist with a very high degree of equality, like existed in India in the earlier period of India, like exists in the Nordic countries today. It exists. Japan has a far higher amount of equality than most other democracies. The problem is more the capture of democracy, or the capture of government, inequality, technological change, and all these other factors that leads people to look for a charismatic single person who will tell them that all of these other complicated problems, I will solve them myself. And certainly that's not unique to any place. Indonesia has people like that. I certainly think that although he is more to the right of Duterte, Prabowo fits exactly into that mold. He didn't win, but he might be able to run again, but he directly sells himself in the same way that Duterte, Trump, Bolsonaro, others approach people. And instead of talking about problems that are in a complicated way, they say, I'm going to fix this myself, just trust me. And that can be very appealing to people who have lost faith in the economy, lost faith in the system, etc., to just put their trust in one charismatic leader. But I mean, historically, not in every example, but usually when people do that, it does not turn out well.
Well, speaking of disappointment of the masses, is the Washington consensus still alive? Is there any country in the world where its liberal recipe for development is being applied and regarded as fair and effective?
I mean, I think that I don't know the answer to that. There probably are, but I mean, I think every country, even countries in Asia that were historically committed to growth without much social welfare net, like Singapore and South Korea and others, even Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong's not a country, but as an economic entity, have sort of moved away and have recognized that you have to have greater equity with growth or else it fails. Even Singapore, which historically was a very small budget, lean government type place, very uninterested in social welfare, has moved away from that. So I guess the answer is no, but a lot of countries that sort of initially subscribed to that consensus are still pursuing aspects of it.
What is your assessment then of the other one, the Beijing consensus? Do you think it works? And is China itself faithful to the tenets of that consensus?
Yeah, I mean, it's worked for China, but I'm not sure it's replicable in a lot of places. I mean, China has a lot of advantages that most other countries do, although Indonesia, I'm not suggesting that Indonesia should become an authoritarian capitalist country, but Indonesia has some of those advantages, but few other countries have them. China has benefited from having a massive amount of foreign investment that wanted to come into China. Two, China has an enormous domestic consumer market. So when the Chinese government needed to boost the economy through domestic growth, they were able to do so. That's not possible if you're a much smaller country. It is possible in Indonesia. Indonesia could enjoy higher growth simply by, and Jokowi has talked about this many times, simply by improving the infrastructure and improving domestic investment and improving Indonesians' ability to buy things. But most countries don't have 200 or 300 million people or a billion people. China also benefited enormously from the way that the system was both authoritarian and the government directed capital, but also was capitalist enough that they allowed for a certain amount of development. It's very hard to replicate. So, I mean, the only other country that really has replicated that effectively before was Singapore. So I'm not sure it's really possible. I mean, Singapore wouldn't say that, but, they're not necessarily proud of that, boast of that. But in the early period of China's reform and opening, a lot of Chinese officials, even Deng himself, but a lot of Chinese officials came to Singapore. They studied at Singaporean think tanks and universities, and they were very interested in following sort of Singapore's management of the economy and slow opening. So it's not even necessarily true that China itself came up with this model. I mean, some of the developmental models were not so different from those pursued by Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea in the Cold War either.
Well, maybe I should bring up the matter of the China debt trap. Is this real, and how can developing nations avoid it if they are still to engage in development cooperation with China?
I mean, I think there is definitely real aspects of it. I'm not sure that China is necessarily trying to entrap every country. I don't think that that's accurate, but I think that it's accurate that before, a lot of Chinese banks under the BRI were making loans that were not financially sustainable, and some countries were taking them either because they desperately needed infrastructure or because there were corrupt reasons for it, or because some combination of both. And in some cases, like the most obvious example is that may be familiar to Indonesians is Sri Lanka, but there are others. Countries essentially gave away important infrastructure to China to pay for their debts. But I mean, I think the Chinese government has recognized that That's not good for its global image. It's not good for their image to be seen as taking other countries' ports. They may want the access to the ports, even strategic access, or they may want access to the telecommunications system. They may want preferential market share, but to be seen as taking developing countries' infrastructure is not, or being the creditor that takes things from developing countries is not an image they want. So the Xi administration has reevaluated that. So, I mean, I think developing countries need to speak up. And China actually listens probably more when Southeast Asian countries complain about certain things than they do about the U.S. than they do when the U.S. does, because they want to be perceived as a benign actor in Southeast Asia or South Asia. So they're more willing in some ways to listen at the Malaysian government or Thai government or whoever, Sri Lanka, complains about something than they are the U.S., where if the U.S. complains about something, the Chinese government just writes it off automatically. So I think the approach that, for example, that Mahathir took after the 2018 election was the right one from a middle-income country's perspective. He accurately phrased Malaysia's problems with some of China's infrastructure financing investment. He tried to push for a better deal from China, but he didn't destroy Malaysia's relationship with China. I think that was whatever Mahathir's other problems, I think that was a fairly effective and appropriate approach.
Well,
I would probably took that approach more, actually.
Well, I have two last questions. The first is, if President-elect Biden were to consult you on how to pursue U.S. relations with Southeast Asia, not China, Southeast Asia, what would be your advice?
Well, I would thank him for consulting me. I don't think that's too likely, but I mean, some of the things I already said. I mean, I think it's unlikely that the U.S. Congress would approve the United States rejoining any Asian trade agreements. I think the Biden administration and the new USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative, she has a fairly significant amount of knowledge of Asian trade deals, should at least signal that they want to rejoin multilateral trade regimes in Asia and make that a priority. I think countries in Asia will understand if Biden puts in a good faith effort to do that and he can't get that done. That's not great, but I think he needs to at least make that a priority. I think he already has shown that climate change is going to be a top priority. I think he needs to show that to other countries. I think that he needs to show Southeast Asian states and everyone in the region, not just Southeast Asia, but Northeast Asia to Central Asia, South Asia, everyone who is up close with China, that like I said, the US and China can have not a good relationship without putting other countries in the position where they feel like they A, have to choose sides, and B, are worried about a potential actual conflict. I think the Biden administration probably needs to just show up. I mean, it's hard to do in a pandemic, but both the Trump administration and often failed to Trump did come to Southeast Asia for an extended period early in his term, but then he sort of lost interest. And I think it's valuable for the president to show up at Asia's regional meetings and not just ignore them. This would be the top things I would probably mention if we were to bring it up.
Well, and if President Joko Widodo would consult you on how to approach bilateral relations with the United States, how would you advise him?
I think Joko is in a difficult position now because there is already, and he has limited interaction with senior U.S. officials. They were a little mystified. They've been kind of mystified by him, which is understandable, but in somewhat of the same way that some Indonesian foreign policy specialists have been mystified by him. And like I said, his focus has really been the domestic economy and very much from a non-foreign policy view. That now combined with the fact that Jokowi is being criticized by at least some in Washington for the last 2 years of sort of more restrictive approach to the media, more restrictive approach to criticism, etc. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I think that to the extent that U.S. policymakers at this point are open to whatever Jokowi says, I think that they would be open to a Jokowi shift in which he just simply made foreign policy a bigger interest. Not even really with the U.S., but just regionally. But I don't have any, not with the U.S. But I think Jokowi as taking a more regional leadership role would be welcomed. But I don't think that that's very likely. I mean, I think one thing that's been very consistent with Jokowi whether you like him or not, has been from the whole time, from when he was mayor of Solo, from when he was mayor in Jakarta, to the presidency. One of the things that people like about him is that he seems to be very consistent, and he portrays himself as very consistent. Unfortunately, from a foreign policy perspective, he's been consistently focused on things that are not really relevant to foreign policy, but I understand why he's focused.
Well, thank you, Joshua, for sharing your thoughts with us. It has been a very enlightening, I think, 90 minutes.
Okay, well, thanks for having me.
Yes, and it has been a very enlightening conversation, and it has been a pleasure and an honor to have you with us.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Friends, that was Mr. Joshua Kurlantzick, author of influential books that have shed light on the riddle of China, Southeast Asia, and the dynamics of democracy and populism. Goodbye for now, and take care.